Chapter 3. Patrick sat, staring at his open door for some time. He read and reread the few paragraphs of the letter his mother had been writing to him just before she died. Why now? Why had his mother not attempted to share some of this information with him before now? He tossed the letter on the desk. It was true. He had asked her not to tell him about Amanda, but it was not as if she could not have slipped something in before now, if she truly felt, as this letter said, overwhelmed with the grief that his losing the lady who held his heart would bring him. He had not suddenly asked her about Amanda, and yet she was writing to him about her. She could have ignored his request 3 years ago, but she did not. She had only done it now, when she knew that Amanda would soon choose a husband and would never be his. He shook his head and scowled at that letter. Now was not even the first time that Amanda had almost been forever lost to him. According to his mother, Amanda had received an offer last year. Yet, his mother had not written to him about that. There was only one reason that his confused and distraught mind could give for his mother never mentioning any of this to him before now, Mrs. Thompson. It had to be that Amanda's mother had not yet approved of him. He rose and paced a circuit of the room. What had Mrs. Thompson said about that letter? After she read it, she knew he needed to read it. Of course she did. His mother's words would be far more persuasive in putting Amanda forward to him than Mrs. Thompson's would be. And apparently now, thanks to the death of his brother, Patrick was finally acceptable. He was an estate owner after all, and not just a mere second son, attempting to find his way in the world through some lowly profession. He blew out a frustrated breath and shook his head. He was only an estate owner, if he chose to keep Ashmore Lodge. And at the moment he was not certain he cared to retain it, or anything that would remind him of Amanda. There was only one thing to do. He must go speak with Amanda. It was the only way he was going to rid his house of his mother's conniving friend. Then he would drown his sorrows in a bottle of something, write a letter to his brother's solicitor regarding the disposal of his inheritance, and prepare the staff to accept a new master, one who did not bear the name Mullins. Patrick descended the stairs and took 2 steps toward the library before retreating to the portrait gallery. As he walked along the length of the room, he stopped now and then to remember who the relations were who were staring back at him. It would be difficult to disappoint so many generations of Mullins, but what else was he to do? He could not stay here where he would be forced to see her. He would do a fine job of remembering how unworthy he was, without the constant reminder. He moved slowly, deliberately, reverently, from one ancestor to the next, until he came to the last portrait, the one of himself with his brother and their parents. As tears gathered in his eyes at the sight of the family he had lost, he attempted to push them aside by recalling just how tiring it had been to sit for that portrait, and how his dear mother had borne his impatience so well, how he missed her. This portrait would most certainly accompany him to his new home, wherever that should be. He turned and shook his head as he looked back down the gallery. He had hoped that this would be his home, that one day he would add a painting of his own family to this wall. But with a final sigh and a sharp pang of regret in his heart, he resigned himself to parting with Ashmore, and disappointing all these ancestors whose likenesses hung here. "I had heard you had returned," said Mrs. White, joining him in the gallery, a day early, I might add. Patrick tucked his morose mood away as best he could and chuckled at her teasing scold. He could tell she was not entirely put out to see him ahead of schedule. "I have always been impatient, have I not?" "Oh, indeed," his housekeeper agreed most readily, as they stood in front of the painting of Patrick's family. "But then, so was your father." She turned her head to look at him. "And yet he was as fine a master as I ever had. I suspect you will be very much like him." Patrick pressed his lips together, thinking better of what he wished to say. He could not disappoint her now, not so soon after just arriving. "Thank you," he muttered instead, before excusing himself to do what he did not wish to do, but felt must be done. "Miss Thompson," he said as he entered the library. She was sitting in his favourite chair, looking toward the garden doors, which were now hidden behind heavy drapes. It would be so easy for him to throw himself at her feet and ask her to be his, but he could not, for he had no desire to be accepted for his inheritance and nothing else. Your mother has insisted that we speak to one another, he continued, clasping his hands behind his back, and standing as if he were giving an account to his colonel about some duty that had been completed. However, I do not see a great need for a long, drawn-out discussion. He faltered as she turned toward him, and he saw her tear-stained face. He dropped his gaze to look at the arm of the chair instead of her, and willed his heart to stay strung together in some fashion, rather than crumbling as it wished to do. I must apologize for causing you pain, but it is for your own good. He shook his head and turned from her. Those were nearly the same words she had said to him 4 years ago, and it hurt his heart as much now to say them, as it had to hear them all that time ago. I will not be staying at Ashmore Lodge, so I fear I'm not an acceptable choice for one such as yourself. There. He had said it, and it sounded as hideous spoken aloud as it did when just a thought. His shoulders sagged, nearly unable to bear up under the strain of the task he had set before himself. Go to town as you planned, he said. Find a husband worthy of you, one who will please your mother. I have never been, and never will be, that man. Some of the anger from earlier began to return, and his shoulders lifted. This was for the best. Supposing he had command of his sensibilities, he turned toward her and bowed. I thank you, once again, for preparing the house so well for my return. I do regret that I will not be staying longer than the few weeks necessary, to see that all is in order to dispense of the estate. With that he left the room. It was cowardly of him not to give her an opportunity to respond, and he knew it. However, one did not stand around waiting for the enemy to retaliate when making a sneak attack, especially when one felt as vulnerable to surrender as he did within the intimacy of the dimly lit library. Exposing one's weakness was not among the lessons taught in how to win a battle. One made his strike, and moved on to what needed to be done next. He could contemplate casualties and other such things when the campaign was over. For now he needed to focus on his next objective of informing Mrs. Thompson that he had done as she requested. He had spoken to her daughter. Mrs. Thompson. She looked up at him from where she sat near the hearth in the sitting room. Have you spoken to Amanda already? He nodded. I have. You will wish to take her home, where she can recover from her disappointment in the comfort of familiar surroundings. I beg your pardon? Mrs. Thompson looked at him aghast. I am not keeping Ashmore Lodge, Mrs. Thompson, and therefore I will not be pursuing your daughter, as I will not be the proper sort of husband she deserves. It was much easier to speak of these things to Mrs. Thompson without his heart threatening to shatter, for the very sight of her aroused his disgust at having been tossed aside, only to be picked up again when what he possessed matched her desires for her daughter. What do you mean you are not keeping Ashmore Lodge? Patrick turned to find a wild-eyed Amanda at the door to the sitting room. Just that, he said, as calmly as one could when faced on two sides by displeased women. I am not keeping Ashmore. I am selling it. I had not thought to, but then, once I got here, I realized it would be for the best. For the best? Amanda nearly shouted. For whose best? He swallowed. For mine. The only thing about giving up his home that was for his best was that it would allow him to live in some distant location, far away from where he would have to be reminded of her and the family she would have. For Ashmore's, he added. How is it best for either you or the estate? Amanda stomped toward him. This place has been in your family for generations. Your mother would be disappointed, Mrs. Thompson added from her seat near the fire. Her words turned his thoughts from sweeping Amanda into his arms and assuring her he would not leave to something more suiting to his purpose, bitterness. Yes, I will have to live with that knowledge, he said, turning toward Mrs. Thompson, while still keeping a watch on her daughter. But then I am used to living with regret. I have had 4 years to practice, so adding my mother's displeasure to what I already carry should not be too difficult a thing to do. There is always the hope, I suppose, if I continue my career as an officer, that one of the skirmishes into which I am flung will rid me of the ability to feel regret, not that I was so fortunate up to now. That seemed to quell some of the anger he saw in Amanda's eyes, while causing her mother to look horrified. Apparently neither of them knew what destruction they had caused in his life. What do you mean you have not been fortunate? Amanda asked. I am still alive, he replied flatly. He had never entered battle wishing to die some painful death at the end of a bayonet, or from a musket's or cannon's ball, but there were moments when that pain had seemed more welcome than the pain he faced in remembering her. You wish to die? Amanda moved toward a chair, her hand out in front of her as if she needed to feel her way to it. Often, he whispered. She sank down onto the edge of the chair. Because of me? He gave a sharp nod of his head. But I wished more to see my mother again than to die, so I did my best to not be killed. However, now, well, there is not much reason left, is there? He turned away from her as she dissolved into tears, crossed to the window, and stared out into the blackness. No wonder you hate me, she said. I do not hate you, he said without turning toward her. I love you as much now as I did 4 years ago. But I sent you away. He shook his head. No, your mother sent me away. It was her persuasion that did the job of parting me from both my mother and you. You did not have to sail to the Canadas, Mrs. Thompson cried. You could have studied the law or taken orders. He laughed bitterly and turned from the window, and be near enough to watch another more acceptable choice court and win the desire of my heart. He shook his head. I could not then, and I will not now. The Canadas are not so dreadful a place. Parts are actually quite civilized. Mrs. Thompson rose from her seat and approached him. But if you love her, why do you not attempt to win her? Because she does not love me, he replied. But I do, Amanda cried. I have for years. Sorrow overwhelmed him as he shook his head. I wish I could believe that. Why do you not? Amanda asked. Why did your mother wish for me to read the letter left by my mother? Amanda's brow furrowed. Perhaps because it was from your mother. It was her last words to you. He turned toward the window again. I also wish I could believe that, but I do not. How he wished he could just believe that both Amanda and Mrs. Thompson welcomed him for him, and not for his estate. Of Amanda's love, he could more readily convince his heart, because he longed with every fibre of his being to be loved by her. Then what reason do you give it? There was no mistaking the anger in Mrs. Thompson's voice. I am now acceptable. My brother has died, and I am now acceptable. What greater feat would there be than to secure your daughter as the mistress of an estate so near to your home? He shrugged. It is brilliant manoeuvring. However, I do not wish to be a pawn in some game. If you will excuse me, I've had a long day. I will not be fleeing Ashmore in the middle of the night, so you may attempt to work on me at some later time if you choose. However, if you do not, I will understand. He bowed to Amanda. I wish you well in your season. I hope you can find someone who is truly worthy of you. How many times had he fled her presence now? He was not certain he wished to keep count, for with each removal from her presence his heart crumbled a little more. If only he could be assured of her love for him. If only he could see himself as worthy of her, because of who he was, and not because of an inheritance that had been thrust upon him. Then, then, he might finally find happiness.